in the year 1874. The Blackridge family was known for only two things. One, they were among the poorest people in all of Missouri. And two, by sunrise on a single night, their entire fate had changed forever. No one saw what happened inside that house. No one heard the whispers behind those rotten wooden walls. But when the doors opened the next morning, every member of the Blackridge family looked different. Their faces weren't twisted, their eyes were, as if something inside them had just woken up, and it wasn't human. The townspeople swore they heard footsteps echoing from the Blackridge home long after the family had stopped walking. Others said their voices sounded borrowed, like every word was spoken by something hiding behind their lungs. But the strangest rumor? The Blackridge family didn't earn their wealth overnight, they traded for it, and the price wasn't money, it was blood. One child from every generation would die without explanation. And the town believed this wasn't a curse, it was a payment. A debt that the Blackridge bloodline was still paying, even after 150 years. Tonight, I'm taking you inside the truth they never wanted anyone to hear. A truth found in a sealed church basement, written on a torn, reddish page that smelled like rust and rot. A page that held only one chilling line. The oath must never be broken. If you think this is just another tragic family mystery, think again. This story will follow you long after the video ends. Let's begin. Silas Blackridge was not a man known for patience, mercy, or faith, but in the year 1874, desperation can twist even the strongest spine into a curve that bends toward darkness. His family's once thriving coal business was collapsing under debt. His workers were abandoning the mines after a string of fatal accidents, and starvation had already crept into the corners of his estate like a cold, unwelcome guest. The newspapers wrote that he was cursed with misfortune, but the few who truly knew him whispered that he was cursed with pride, refusing to let fate swallow the Blackridge legacy without a fight. It was during those bleak months that Silas became obsessed with an old Appalachian tale about a hidden ritual capable of exchanging one thing for another: wealth for blood, longevity for loyalty, and fortune for the surrender of something far more precious than gold. He convinced himself it was just folklore at first, a ghost story miners told to scare each other, but desperation has a way of softening the boundary between myths and possibilities. So, when Silas found a set of cryptic symbols carved into a collapsed tunnel wall deep in his mine symbols, matching those written in a forbiddance ledger he had stolen from a traveling mystic, he took it not as coincidence but as a calling. One stormy night, after ensuring the miners had gone home and the estate was quiet, he descended into the deepest shaft with nothing but a lantern, a rusted pickaxe, and the old leather-bound book that promised salvation through sacrifice. The deeper he went, the more unnatural the air became, thick and metallic like the breath of something sleeping. The tunnel walls shook as if the earth itself was warning him to turn back, but Silas pressed on until he reached a narrow chamber sealed off by fallen rock. He cleared it stone by stone with bloodied hands, driven by a madness that only a dying legacy can ignite. When he finally broke through, he stepped into a pocket of the mine untouched for centuries, its walls blackened with a mineral no one had ever mined, and its floor marked with the same symbols from the book. His lantern flickered as if repulsed by the air itself. Silas placed the ledger at the center of the ritual markings and began reading the incantation in a trembling voice. The words felt wrong in his mouth, too heavy, too ancient, too aware. He tried to stop halfway through, but something in the chamber shifted, a low hum vibrating in the walls like a heartbeat returning after centuries of silence. Fear twisted his gut, but he pushed forward, convinced that turning back would condemn his family to ruin. As he spoke the final lines, the temperature dropped instantly, freezing the sweat on his skin. The lantern went out, leaving him swallowed by absolute black. Then, from somewhere behind him, a breath exhaled. Not human, not animal. Something older, deeper, and infinitely patient. Silas felt a presence circle him, unseen but undeniable, brushing against his mind with a promise that filled him with both triumph and terror. The entity demanded a price, and in that moment Silas understood that it did not want gold or land. It wanted lineage, it wanted names. It wanted every future Blackridge soul bound to a pact that could never be unwritten. and Silas, trembling in the dark, whispered his acceptance, sealing an oath that would turn his family into the wealthiest bloodline in the valley, and the most damned in American history. The days following Silas Blackridge's descent into the mine were shrouded in a strange, almost sacred hush, as if the world itself paused to witness the dawn of something unnatural. By sunrise, the air over the valley had changed. A thick fog rolled in, not of ordinary mist, but something that clung to the skin and smelled faintly of iron and smoke. Within a week, the effects of the ritual became undeniable. The Blackridge mines, once barely profitable, began yielding coal of a quality that rivaled anything in the state. Orders poured in faster than the miners could load the carts, and word spread that the Blackridge name had become synonymous with wealth overnight. Townspeople whispered, half in awe, half in fear, that Silas had found a shortcut to fortune that no honest man could earn. Contracts that had once been denied were now signed willingly. Creditors forgave debts without explanation. Merchants offered credit before payment was requested, and the local bank's vault seemed to open itself for him. Within months, the Blackridge estate had grown almost unrecognizably grand. Wooden fences were replaced with wrought iron, the stables expanded into sprawling barns, and rooms were redecorated with imported furniture and rugs that no one in the region had ever seen before. Yet the wealth did not stop at material possessions. Silas noticed that disputes which would have once consumed him, arguments over mine leases, workers' pay, and rival coal families, suddenly evaporated. Everyone seemed eager to comply with his demands, to offer their loyalty without hesitation, and even those who had been bitter enemies appeared to bend to his will. Neighbors could not explain it, but it became clear that the Blackridge family no longer faced obstacles in the natural sense. Fortune flowed to them like a river swollen beyond reason, unstoppable and untouchable. With prosperity came attention. Visitors from distant towns, curious merchants, and even state officials sought audiences with Silas, hoping to uncover the secret behind his sudden rise, yet no one could discover the truth. The mines remained locked during off hours, and the hidden chamber deep below had vanished behind walls of stone that seemed to seal themselves. Rumors began to circulate, darkening the awe with suspicion. People claimed they had seen shadows moving where no one was, heard laughter echoing from empty halls, and felt cold drafts in rooms that were otherwise sealed tight. Some whispered that the Blackridge fortune was cursed, that their rapid rise could only have been achieved by unnatural means. Still, Silas paid them no mind. He reveled in the wealth, convinced that the ritual had been worth the unknown cost, that the whispers of superstition were the complaints of those too weak to seize power. Yet, even as he marveled at his newfound dominion, the first strange occurrences began to ripple through the family. The Blackridge children, playing in the gardens and running through the halls, occasionally froze as if hearing a voice no one else could. Servants reported that family members would stare into mirrors for hours, their reflections flickering unnaturally. Silas dismissed these signs at first, attributing them to overactive imaginations and the excitement of sudden prosperity. But in private moments, late at night, he noticed the change in the air around him. It was heavier charged with a presence that watched and waited, reminding him, though subtly, that the price of the fortune was not yet complete, and that the invisible ledger of the pact he had made was already being written in ways he could not yet see. The first child born after the Blackridge family's sudden rise came into the world under an eerie quiet, the kind of stillness that makes the night feel heavier, like it is holding its breath. From the moment the infant drew its first cry, a mark became visible on the left side of its chest, faint at first, as if pressed by an invisible hand, but unmistakably a handprint burned into the skin. At first, Silas and his wife dismissed it as a birthmark, a minor anomaly with no meaning beyond coincidence. But as the days passed, the mark became sharper, darker, almost glowing when the candlelight flickered across the nursery walls. By the time the child's first teeth appeared, whispers had begun to infiltrate the estate. From the servants in the kitchen to the miners returning from the pits, strange murmurs spoke of the mark, calling it a sign of unnatural favor or perhaps a curse. The child itself, when awake, would often stop crying mid-scream and stare into corners where nothing existed. Its tiny gaze followed shadows that moved against the grain of the light, and occasionally a soft whisper unintelligible, but undeniably there would trail from the nursery walls as though the air itself was trying to speak to the infant. When the second child was born, the pattern repeated, and then the third, and with each birth, the mark became an undeniable trait of the family line. Silas began to grow uneasy. He could no longer ignore the mounting evidence that the ritual he had performed in the mine had left more than wealth. It had left a tangible, physical signature on every generation. The handprint, sometimes black as coal, sometimes red as embers, was more than a symbol. It was a warning, a tether between the living and something that lurked unseen. Doctors and midwives who examined the children could find no cause. No burn, no disease, no congenital defect explained the mark's presence. It seemed to pulse faintly, particularly when the household was quiet, as if responding to something only it could sense. The children, as they grew, displayed other oddities as well. They would speak to unseen figures, answering questions no one had asked, laughing or crying at events no one else could perceive. Mirrors became a source of terror. The reflections would sometimes lag behind, smile when the child did not, or blink when the eyes were closed. Despite the mansion's grand hallways and the wealth that surrounded them, a sense of isolation crept over the family. Visitors often noticed how unnervingly quiet the children were, how they could suddenly fix their eyes on a shadow or a corner and remain motionless for minutes. Silas began to keep the ledger from the ritual close at hand, hoping to find some clue to what the mark signified, but the book offered nothing concrete beyond cryptic symbols and lines that seemed to shift under his gaze. The family began to understand, perhaps too late, that the wealth had come at a cost far beyond what Silas had imagined. The children bore the first evidence, the first scar of a pact that would demand more than material obedience. The whispers that accompanied them, soft at first, began to intensify, and the shadows they watched so intently grew longer and more aggressive. Nights became torturous. Every unexplained creak in the hall, every fleeting shape in the candlelight, became proof that something ancient and patient had tethered itself to the Blackridge bloodline. Even Silas, who had stared into the mine's darkness and embraced the ritual, felt a prickling fear whenever he looked upon the handprints. They were a reminder that the power he had sought was never free, and that the invisible debt had already begun to claim its collateral, marking each new life as its own. As the Blackridge family's wealth swelled, a shadow of dread began to settle over each generation. Invisible yet unmistakable, like the pressure of storm clouds that never break but always threaten. The town of Black Hollow initially celebrated their prosperity, awed by the rapid expansion of their estates, the extravagant feasts, and the wealth that seemed to materialize out of thin air. But soon, the atmosphere around the family began to shift, carrying with it an unspoken terror. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with the disappearances. Every Blackridge born after the ritual would live their lives surrounded by luxury and privilege. Yet each would vanish on their 33rd birthday, as if an invisible hand had reached down to reclaim what was promised. Neighbors first noticed when a young heir failed to appear at the annual town fair, the same child who had been laughing in the gardens hours before now simply gone. Searches of the estate and surrounding lands yielded nothing, yet a faint scent of iron and smoke lingered in the air where the child had been last seen. The second disappearance was more unsettling. A daughter who had been betrothed and celebrated by the entire town disappeared from her own wedding ceremony, leaving only her wedding dress abandoned at the edge of the family's estate. Panic rippled through the household, but Silas, though tormented, refused to speak of the curse aloud. He had learned too well that acknowledging it could only make it more real, and denial became the family's only fragile shield. Over time, patterns emerged. Every 33rd birthday coincided with the same ominous signs: flickering lights, cold drafts that carried whispers, and shadows that stretched unnaturally across walls, reaching as if to grasp the destined Blackridge before they could escape. Even the children who had survived these years began to dread their own birthdays, sensing in some unspoken way that time was a predator, and no celebration could halt the inevitable. Within the mansion, fear festered in corners untouched by candlelight. Servants whispered that they had seen figures vanishing in mirrors or glimpsed fleeting shadows trailing the family members as they walked through halls, always at the edge of vision, always gone when attention turned fully toward them. The Blackridges themselves, though born to luxury, could not escape the unease that clung to them like a second skin. Family dinners became tense affairs, with Silas often staring at each child as if calculating which of them would be next to disappear. The mark on their chests, that burned handprint, seemed to pulse and darken as the birthdays approached, warning the family of the approaching claim. Scholars and outsiders, when permitted to visit, marveled at the family's opulence, but sensed the weight pressing on the estate and invisible ledger of loss that hung over the Blackridge name. Over time, stories leaked into the town, half-formed rumors of a curse and a pact made in a darkened mine, whispered late at night by those who had glimpsed the strange marks or heard the faint voices drifting through the hallways. Attempts to intervene or uncover the truth were met with silence or inexplicable accidents. No outsider could endure the estate for long without falling sick, losing their nerve, or disappearing entirely themselves. Each disappearance reinforced the chilling lesson that wealth had been bought at the highest cost imaginable. The Blackridges were not merely rich, they were bound to something far older, something patient, calculating, and insistent, claiming their own according to a timetable set by the ritual Silas had performed decades earlier. The family's fortunes, once the envy of the valley, became a gilded cage trapping them within walls of luxury while a predator waited just beyond the candle's light, each member marked from birth, each destined to be taken in turn, and each vanishing, leaving only the silent echo of the oath that had started it all. It was the youngest of the Blackridge heirs, Evelyn, who first discovered the secret that Silas had spent decades hiding beneath the estate. She was only 14, curious and restless, often wandering the halls at odd hours when the household slept, drawn by whispers that seemed to originate from places no one else could hear. On one such night, guided by a faint scent of earth and iron, she stumbled across a loose stone in the floor of the library. The stone moved under her touch, revealing a narrow, descending staircase carved into the bedrock below. At the bottom, dust thick enough to choke a man settled over the floor, and the air smelled of minerals. Old soot and something far older, a presence that made her skin crawl despite the warmth of the lamps above. Evelyn stepped carefully into the chamber, her small lantern casting quivering light over walls covered in symbols that mirrored those in the ledger her grandfather had kept hidden. At the center of the room, a long, leather-bound book lay atop a stone pedestal, its pages yellowed and inscribed in a hand that was not quite human, curling and twisting in ways that defied comprehension. The book was a ledger, but not one for accounting. It contained names, dates, and cryptic marks, each corresponding to a member of the Blackridge family. As Evelyn's eyes scanned the pages, a chill ran down her spine. She realized that each name was accompanied by a symbol resembling a small handprint, sometimes dark, sometimes crimson, the same mark that she and all her siblings bore on their chests. The ledger detailed more than identities. It recorded the terms of the oath itself, outlining a timeline that matched the family's history of wealth and sudden, unexplained disappearances. Each generation had been accounted for, each soul promised in exchange for fortune, each payment recorded with meticulous cruelty. Evelyn understood, in a way no child should, that her family's rise to power had never been natural. Every coin, every contract, every gift of luck had been extracted at a price that was not written in money but in life. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken as she read, and the lantern flickered violently, casting shadows that danced along the walls as if animated by the ledger itself. A whispering voice echoed faintly through the chamber, low and insistent, almost as if the book were trying to speak. It did not scream, it did not demand. It simply reminded her that the names in its pages were bound by a promise that could not be broken. For hours, Evelyn pored over the ledger, piecing together patterns, realizing that the disappeared family members were not accidents, not tragedies, but inevitable consequences of the oath. And as she traced her finger down the names of those yet to reach their 33rd birthdays, a creeping terror settled over her. This hidden room, sealed for generations, was both a tomb and a warning, a silent testament to the covenant her grandfather had made and the relentless force that enforced it. The realization weighed on her, suffocating in its inevitability, that the Blackridge family had been living atop a ticking clock, their wealth a gilded chain, their luxury an illusion built upon a ledger of souls. Evelyn knew that merely seeing the ledger was dangerous. The entity bound by the oath seemed aware of intrusion, and she could almost feel its gaze brushing her from the shadows, patient, calculating, waiting for the moment when it would claim what it was owed. She tried to memorize the pages, to take mental notes, but the weight of the knowledge pressed on her, heavy and inescapable. Every corner of the chamber seemed alive, every symbol on the wall a reminder that the family's fortune was inseparable from the price yet to be paid. And that understanding the ledger did not make her safe, only more aware of the fate that loomed over her, her siblings, and every Blackridge yet to be named in the book that had been hidden for so long. By the time the Blackridge children reached their late teens, the presence tied to the family oath had begun making itself unmistakably known. It started subtly, with fleeting glimpses in mirrors, the corner of a candlelit hallway, or a reflection in a polished window that didn't match reality. At first, the family dismissed it as trickery of light or the imagination of overworked eyes, but those rationalizations crumbled the moment the figure appeared fully. It was humanoid, yet impossible, its features blurred as though painted by smoke and shadow, and it moved with a fluidity no living body could mimic. When it first spoke, the voice was a faint whisper carried on the draft, soft enough to be almost ignored but insistent, calling names in a cadence that chilled even Silas Blackridge. The entity claimed nothing outright at first. It simply observed, watching the children as they slept, its form appearing in the reflection of every glass surface, every still body of water, lingering longer than it had reason to, as if marking its next target. The family servants, long accustomed to silence and secrecy, began to murmur of strange occurrences, footsteps echoing through empty halls, doors closing without cause, and children muttering in their sleep to figures no one could see. Each sighting of the entity coincided with a physical reaction from the marked children. The handprints on their chests, once subtle, seemed to darken, almost pulsing beneath the skin when the figure was near. A shiver would pass through the household, a cold so intense it could seep through blankets, clothing, and walls, signaling that the entity's attention had chosen someone for its impending claim. Silas himself, though long hardened by greed and the darkness he had invited into his family's life, began to tremble whenever it appeared. He realized that the ritual he had performed so many years before had done more than bind wealth to his family. It had bound them to a patient, calculating force that was never satisfied by the promise of money alone. The entity did not simply enforce the oath. It orchestrated its collection with meticulous care, ensuring the timing and method were precise, each disappearance an echo of the first bargains made in that coal-stained chamber decades ago. Children tried to evade it, fleeing rooms or locking themselves in closets, but the shadows followed, creeping through cracks, emerging in reflections, whispering their names as though reminding them that no hiding place was beyond its reach. Fear became a constant companion in the estate, threaded into every corridor and every quiet hour before dawn. Even the servants noticed the change. Meals were eaten in tense silence, laughter had long since vanished from the halls, and the Blackridge children spoke less, their eyes darting to corners and mirrors as if expecting the figure to appear at any moment. Attempts to leave the estate or venture into the surrounding town brought no relief. The entity was not confined to the family home. It moved like a presence tethered to blood itself, lurking unseen in every shadow, every window pane, and even reflected in pools of water outside. Silas began keeping the ledger close, desperately trying to predict who the entity would mark next, but the symbols shifted subtly, as though aware that the observer was watching, a living, evolving record that refused to be fully understood. Each manifestation of the figure served as a reminder. The oath was not a one-time transaction but a living contract, and the entity was both enforcer and collector, patient beyond measure, waiting for the moment each family member reached the threshold of their due. Even in the daylight, a feeling of being observed clung to the children, and every step taken outside the estate carried a tension that could not be explained. The entity's presence was no longer rumor or hallucination, it was the undeniable reality of the Blackridge curse, asserting itself with a slow, relentless certainty, and ensuring that no one within the family could ignore the claim that had been made. Long before any of them had drawn breath, by the time the third generation of Blackridges had grown old enough to sense the invisible leash that bound their family, whispers of rebellion began to stir in the youngest heirs. One among them, Jonathan, a spirited and headstrong teenager, could not bear the idea that his life and the lives of his siblings were dictated by a ritual performed long before they were born. He had grown up hearing the stories, the vanishings, the shadows, the ledger of names that seemed to write itself with each new birth, and every instance of wealth or success felt tainted by the unspoken cost. Driven by defiance, Jonathan became determined to find the original site of the ritual in the coal mine and destroy it. Convinced that if he could undo the foundation of the oath, the family could finally be free from the invisible predator that haunted their lives. He prepared meticulously, learning everything he could about the mine, the hidden tunnels, and the forbidden chamber that had been sealed for decades. On a moonless night, he descended alone, lantern in hand, every step echoing ominously against the stone walls. The mine was silent, but the silence itself felt alive, almost sentient, pressing against him with invisible fingers that tugged at his confidence. When he reached the original chamber, the signs of the ritual were unmistakable. The symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly in the dim light, and the floor still carried the residue of ash and soot from the sacrifices made so many years ago. The ledger lay where his grandfather had left it, its pages fluttering despite the lack of wind, as if eager to reveal the history of debts that had yet to be collected. Jonathan, shaking but resolute, set to work. He struck at the walls, pulled at the symbols, and attempted to tear the ledger from its pedestal, intending to destroy anything that could serve as evidence of the pact. But the moment he disturbed the center of the chamber, the air shifted violently. A cold wind, unnatural and suffocating, whipped around him, snuffing out his lantern and leaving him in a darkness thicker than any he had known. From the shadows, a presence emerged, older, larger, and far more terrifying than any story had prepared him for. It did not speak in words. Its intent pressed directly into his mind, a rush of fear and fury that threatened to overwhelm him entirely. Jonathan realized too late that the ritual site was not merely a place of past transactions, but a seal, a linchpin holding back a force that had grown stronger with every generation. By disturbing it, he had awakened something that was never meant to be interrupted, something that had been waiting patiently, watching each Blackridge, ensuring that the debts were collected at the appointed time. The chamber seemed to stretch and bend, walls pulsating, shadows coiling like serpents around his legs, and whispers filled the air, naming him, calling him, reminding him that defiance was not permitted. The ledger's pages turned violently, as if the book itself were alive, the names of his family members highlighted in a glowing red script that burned into his vision. Jonathan understood in a horrifying instant that breaking the curse was not a matter of brute force or courage. It was an act of hubris, one that could provoke a retaliation far worse than the oath itself. His limbs felt heavy, his thoughts fragmented, and the lantern, now relit by some unseen force, revealed glimpses of shadowy figures emerging from the walls, each one tethered to the Blackridge bloodline, silent yet menacing. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the mind seemed endless, a labyrinth that twisted with each attempt to escape. He realized the truth that his grandfather had never confessed. The Blackridge pact was not simply a debt to be canceled. It was a living, sentient contract, one that demanded obedience and punished defiance with a ferocity that grew exponentially with every attempt to resist. The terror that gripped Jonathan was total, absolute, and as he sank to his knees in the center of the ritual chamber, he understood that the family's wealth, their power, and even their survival were all bound to something far older and more violent than any of them could have ever imagined. The last of the Blackridge heirs, a young woman named Lillian, had grown up under the shadow of the family curse acutely, aware of the vanished siblings whose names still lingered in the ledger she had once glimpsed in secret. Every birthday approached with a tightening knot in her chest, and every shadow in the estate seemed to lean closer, whispering reminders of the oath that had bound her bloodline for generations. Unlike her ancestors, Lillian refused to cower or ignore the entity that haunted her family. She had spent years studying the old manuscripts, exploring the mines, and observing the patterns of the disappearances, determined to confront the source directly. On the eve of her 33rd birthday, she descended into the oldest, most forgotten shaft of the Blackridge mine, following the trail that Silas had once blazed but that had remained sealed for decades. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and soot, and every step echoed through the tunnels like a drumbeat marking the rhythm of inevitability. As she reached the hidden chamber where the oath had been enacted, the walls seemed to breathe, alive with shadows that twisted and writhed in anticipation. The ledger lay where generations before had found it, its pages fluttering as though impatient, as if aware that the final reckoning had come. Lillian's hands trembled as she opened it, scanning the names. Seeing the pattern she had long dreaded, each Blackridge claimed, each birth marked, each soul accounted for, and now her own name written with a scarlet handprint beside it. The entity that had haunted her family all her life made its presence known immediately, coalescing from the shadows into a form that was both vaguely human and impossibly otherworldly. It observed her silently at first, circling like a predator savoring its prey, and she realized that all the lessons, all the attempts to understand and outsmart it, were irrelevant if she could not confront the truth. The chamber itself seemed to shift, walls elongating and contracting, the air vibrating with an almost imperceptible hum that penetrated deep into her bones. Lillian forced herself to stand tall, clutching the ledger, and spoke aloud, demanding answers she had yearned for all her life. The entity responded not with words but with visions, images of every Blackridge who had vanished, floating silently in the darkness, tethered by invisible chains to the oath that Silas had made so long ago. The ledger's pages turned faster, names lighting up like fire, and Lillian understood that the Blackridge family had not merely traded wealth for souls. They had become part of a contract that required their bloodline as a commodity, and the entity that enforced it was patient, relentless, and capable of bending reality itself to collect what was promised. Time seemed to stretch in the chamber, minutes becoming hours, shadows multiplying, and whispers filling every corner, each one calling her by name, reminding her of the inevitability of the oath. Lillian felt the pull, a force strong enough to drag her into the darkness if she resisted, yet she held firm, refusing to surrender to the centuries-old power that had dominated her family. As she stared into the abyss, she realized that understanding the ledger, understanding the oath, was only the beginning. The entity did not merely want compliance, it wanted recognition, acknowledgement of the debts it had patiently collected across generations. And in that moment she saw a path forward, a terrifying, uncertain path that required courage, intelligence, and the willingness to embrace the very darkness that had haunted her lineage. A path that could finally end the curse or claim her as the last soul in the ledger, sealing the Blackridge fate forever. So if you want to see what happens next, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.